The combination of social media and the rise of independent media means traditional elites are losing control of public narratives. And the British government has a plan to fight back. The government has launched a new green paper and public consultation called Watch This Space, a new strategic direction for UK media. The document contends that linear TV, with everyone watching the same few programmes on a limited number of channels, had been, past tense, positive for social cohesion. It says this is now being undermined by the availability of online content, unlimited in scope, and often curated into highly individualized feeds, which often means dubious quality of information. They say this creates an environment which, quote, is divisive and inaccurate in narratives that are more likely to thrive. The Green Paper proposes very anodyne solutions, for example, joint programs with public service broadcasters to promote media literacy. Sounds good. So the public is better equipped to identify misinformation. But this is the proposal in that Green Paper that is causing all the controversy. We will explore legislative options to require social media to make news content from public service media providers and potentially also national and local news publishers prominent and easily discoverable. This is crucial for countering misinformation, especially during times of social unrest or crisis. The public service media providers are currently the BBC, ITV, Channels 4 and 5, STV and S4C. The Green Paper says that they have to adhere to strict standards and also fulfill certain obligations. Historically, they've been rewarded by getting the most prominent channels on linear TV, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But the Green Paper says as linear TV dies out, they need to be guaranteed prominence by other means. Those means could include weighting the YouTube algorithm. That would be to favor public service broadcasters. And YouTube, as a result, is now encouraging other content creators to fight back. YouTube has sent a message to creators on the platform warning about the government's proposals and encouraging creators to respond to that consultation. It says this. The UK government is running a public consultation called Watch This Space, a new strategic direction for UK media. The proposals include mandatory changes to how content is delivered on YouTube. This could direct audiences away from your channel. As a UK creator, this directly impacts your future. Digital content discovery works best when driven by user choice, not legal requirements. Michael, you're a YouTube creator. You are the mastermind or one of the masterminds behind Novara Live. Are you outraged at these proposals? Have they angered you?
I have mixed feelings. Obviously, YouTube is right that this presumably will disadvantage creators who aren't those public service broadcasters, because if someone else is getting pushed up the algorithm, someone else must be getting pushed down. That's how these things work. It's a little bit zero sum. At the same time, my position, I've said it many times on the show, is I think the ecosystem we have, whereby instead of people necessarily tuning into a show or tuning into a channel, you just have all of these various thumbnails competing for clicks, is obviously we do it, right? You have to do it. That's the system. But I don't think the net impact on society has necessarily been a positive one, right? I think it leads to the necessity for sensationalism. It does lead to people living in completely different worlds. It does lead to polarization, obviously. I think YouTube also saying, we think it's best when people get to make their own choices, and so they get their own algorithm. I think it's a little bit self-serving, right? Because this is essentially YouTube saying, we don't want to be regulated, right? We want completely free run to do whatever gets the most clicks. And obviously the reason you have an algorithm that sort of pushes you stuff which conforms to your priors, which might shock you, is because they want you to watch the adverts, right? So that is why they don't want this impact. And I feel a little bit like they're using sort of independent creators as a human shield. I also think, I was reading the Green Paper today. The argument they're making, which is that sort of like there were responsibilities put on the public service broadcasters, and there was a quid pro quo. They would get those 1 to 5 channels. That does make sense, and they were under regulations. And it is now the case that that on YouTube, there isn't the same regulation that you get from Ofcom. There aren't the same obligations about sort of like getting new content, etc. Creates a lot less job. YouTube will say how many jobs have been created sort of in the creator industry, but there are massive teams behind BBC shows, and sort of to make a really advanced documentary, it costs lots of money. And then if you're competing with just lots of people in their bedroom, like and people like us, like it's relatively cheap to do what we do. I mean, I think we're a very lean organization, but I think alongside Novara, we really do need public service broadcasters making like expensive documentaries. And so I have no problem actually with a government deciding to put their thumbs on the scales. Now, obviously, it depends how they do this, right? So if it was always the case that sort of with newspapers that gave a lot of influence to people who were rich enough to be able to buy a newspaper. So there was something very undemocratic about that. It is also the case that sort of by removing all the barriers to entry for new media, I don't necessarily think it has resulted in a society which is more liberated, right? Is one of the big benefits from all the barriers to entry going tends to have been right-wing populism, not like left-wing movements, which is maybe why, I know you're going to get onto this, maybe why it is people on the populist right who have been most vocally opposed to this and most vocally outraged by this.
I mean, before we move on, I think this is really important because you're saying it's not clear if it's been a positive shift in the last 20 years with the arrival of new media, etc., away from that old broadcast model. 5 channels wouldn't be perfect, or 4 channels wouldn't be perfect, but you're all watching the same thing. There's a certain degree of truth. And I wonder, Michael, we have the Iraq War in 2003. There was clearly an effort to corral people to support what the US and Israel was doing in Iran earlier this year. And I just don't think it was possible because of the way that media works. Now, I'll also add, it was an insane war. It was going to unravel really quickly, but I just don't think it works in the same way with the media landscape we have 25 years ago. Equally, Gaza. I think the world saw so quickly what was happening in Gaza and how awful it was. I think, that flip would have taken, probably years actually, with the old media model. So I'm a bit more suspect than you. And I have to say, I completely agree about public service broadcasters. I think if you've got YouTube, and by the way, YouTube I think is much better than X or Facebook in terms of being a net good to society. But if you've got YouTube and there's a slight emphasis given to BBC, Channel 4, ITV, right? Channel 5, nobody watches Channel 5 for news, whatever. Then I agree with you. But here's the thing, Michael. The proposal reads like this: we will explore legislative options to require social media to make news content from public service media providers, we've just said that, and potentially also national and local news publishers, prominent and easily discoverable. I just think that's going to include the likes of The Times, or The Sun. And here's where it gets crazy, Michael. We here at Novara Media are regulated by Impress. We have a higher regulatory standard, I don't think Ipso is particularly good, than The Sun, right? Ultimately, Ipso is about self-regulation by this country's press. They regulate themselves. Novara Media does not regulate itself. So what you could have is something like Novara being downgraded. And we make mistakes, by the way. When we make mistakes, you can correct us because we're held to a certain standard as a result of being regulated by Impress. We would be downrated because we're potentially less reliable than The Sun or The Times, who are regulated by a less judicious regulator. I just can't agree with that. And you said about documentaries. I love BBC documentaries, but we're not talking about documentaries. We're talking about the news. And the BBC hasn't really crowned itself with garlands when it comes to covering the news in recent years. Quickly, Michael, what's your response to that before we move on to the rest of the story?
I mean, I think the point about sort of foreign policy is important. I do think that it does mobilize people in opposition to sort of outrages by the state in a way that sometimes the legacy media was unable to do. In terms of sort of the BBC News, I suppose the way I think about it is I would prefer sort of, at the moment, I feel like we're in a bit of a situation where sort of 20% of the population is watching something like GB News 90% of the time, and 20% of the population is watching something like Novara 90% of the time, and then just sort of sees BBC every now and again. I would prefer people to be watching the right-wing people to be watching GB News half the time and the BBC half the time, the left-wing people to be watching Novara Media half the time and the BBC half the time, because I do think it is very important to live in the same world. I also don't think, I think the BBC has lots of problems with its news, but I do think that it is, it tries to show both sides to an argument in a way that not many other media outlets are able to do. I think it is very valuable. I think it fails on many things, but I think it is probably more accountable than sort of really any other platform in the country. And therefore, I don't think we should shut down the other platforms, but I do think giving it sort of the kind of boost that it had by being Channel One is fair now that people are moving away from linear TV.
I just think, look, the idea of a government, I think it's such a slippery slope. I mean, I've already read it out. I'm not going to read it out again. But the idea that a government or an arm's length body, which is chosen by the Prime Minister and people in the cabinet, the idea that the government gets to discern which outlets are legitimate or more legitimate and less legitimate, I think is really scary. If it's just the BBC. Oh, sorry, go on, Michael.
Well, I was going to say that's already the case, right? Ofcom does decide who gets the license to be a TV channel. Now, I think Ofcom actually has been far too lax when it comes to GB News. But the concept here, which is that you get more access to eyeballs if you have been given approval by a government body, which, let's remember, is sort of like a democratically accountable institution in a way that YouTube isn't. Like, I don't think that is particularly new. Like, I think that is just returning some of the old rules to the new system, which at the moment is a complete Wild West.
So hold on, you're saying that Ofcom, by the way, is the regulator for broadcast. Should Novara Media then need a license to broadcast? Is that what you're saying? A YouTube channel, if it's got 1 million subscribers, so why are you mentioning Ofcom then?
Well, so I think it would be perfectly fair enough to say, if you get some sort of certification from the likes of Ofcom, then you can get a boost on the algorithm. I'd be perfectly happy with that. I think Novara should try and get that certification. I mean, maybe it would change our coverage slightly, maybe for the better.
So I sort of disagree. We'll go on to the rest of the story and we can disagree a bit more. There are some things, I have to say, I do agree with parts of it, particularly on covering elections, by-elections. I think the standards are so onerous for broadcasters. If you said Andy Burnham's name the day before the making of a by-election, you have to name all the candidates, all the parties. Me and Michael, not that we did, can tell people how to vote. That is ridiculous. Because, of course, Novara Media is going from strength to strength. The biggest backlash has so far come from the political right. The YouTube message to creators went viral after it was shared by Basil the Great, a far-right account with over 300,000 followers. They support Restore Britain. Basil the Great said this: breaking, UK government to take control of YouTube algorithm. That's not true. This is pure authoritarianism. Keir Starmer's Andy Burnham's government is set to control the YouTube algorithm by law, stipulating that they must push approved content to UK citizens, and independent voices who criticise the government will be pushed to the back of the queue, making it harder for people to find. YouTube has acknowledged this is happening. This must be stopped. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage has said he would scrap any restrictions on the platform. Look at this appalling state censorship. Labour now want to seize control of YouTube's algorithm. They want YouTube to artificially boost the BBC and Channel 4's content and suffocate independent journalists and producers. The BBC has been biased to pro-mass migration, open borders and net zero views these past few decades. It's part of the reason we're in a mess. The BBC's own internal reports admit and document some of this bias. People have moved to X and YouTube in part as a response to it. And now, Labour want to control what they see there. Reform will scrap this heavy-handed lunacy. I wonder, Michael, is there a danger that people like you and me allow the right to be seen as the true defenders of free speech?
Yeah, I mean, there clearly is a danger. I suppose the danger on the other side is that, I think YouTube are using creators as sort of like human shield so that they can continue to have sort of complete autonomy over what people see. And I don't think that's particularly democratic. I mean, I think also Nigel Farage probably, I think that in this Wild West, we've already seen what's happened. It tends to benefit the populace, right? And it tends to make just everyone a bit more angry, and it makes democracy very hard to do, right? So, and I think the people who are most likely to benefit from it are sort of Trump, Farage, etc., which I think is why they are the loudest about this. And I mean, even in that tweet from Nigel Farage, he kind of justified why the BBC should have prominence, because they have sort of, you might not think they're perfect, right? But would GB News ever have an internal report into bias in its coverage? No, it would be crazy. Right,
so that's because they're not.
The BBC is really the only kind of organisation that does this stuff.
But that's because they're not funded by the taxpayer. I mean, I feel like that's a bit harsh on GB. I suppose Sky gets the money. I suppose in that respect, GB News is unique as a news channel. I'm trying to think of another example. What's the Dave? Does the Dave Comedy Channel have a report about bias because it's a private channel that exists primarily as a result of adverts, right? So what
Yeah,
I mean,
but so if,
so
but I
so
don't
hold
think
on.
that's the only reason.
No, but so if
Sorry,
GB
go
News
on.
if GB News, I'm just trying to pick apart the argument here. So if GB News started to do that, if tomorrow because organisations change, right? If once upon a time the Sun was the Daily Herald and it was actually a left-wing newspaper owned by trade unions, if they changed their culture and then they started to behave more like that, would that satisfy you? Because that's not a structural answer, is it?
Well, so I think that the structural answer would be that you should have Ofcom, which has genuine teeth, and Ofcom says you can. I mean, I don't think GB News should really have a channel, right? Because I don't think that sort of on any ordinary reading of the Ofcom rules, they're an impartial news broadcaster, right? I think they should be able to have a YouTube show if they want, but to me, it doesn't seem like they should get that. So I would have an Ofcom with more teeth, and the Ofcom can determine who is following these rules, and the kind of thing of having like an internal report into bias. I mean, that would presumably get some thumbs up from Ofcom. So I think if GB News were able to, I would have a Ofcom with bigger teeth, and then if GB News can meet it, then yeah, of course they should get privilege in the algorithm as well, as should we.
But because you were just saying, and I agree, we should strengthen Ofcom, right? But you were saying they should be able to just go on YouTube, as if like that is what you can look. If you're going to say this crazy stuff, just go on YouTube. So that's at odds with what you were saying a moment ago. I mean, I totally agree. Ofcom should be beefed up. I think IPSO as a press regulator should actually be a meaningful press regulator, like Leveson, kind of too would have indicated. I think that's why we've not had it. But those are very different things. With ultimately, Michael, the thing is, we have a very weak regulator on newspapers in this country with IPSO. What we're basically saying, potentially with this green paper, is that Novara Media would have to meet stricter standards than the Times and the Sun newspaper. And I think it's pretty obvious why any mainstream political party would want to do that, because somebody like Rupert Murdoch can make life hell for Andy Burnham or for a Tory Prime Minister far more than we can. And I don't like that.
I mean, they probably should have stronger regulations for newspapers as well, right? But I mean, newspapers, even like the crap that people watch on, like the main shows in the United States of America, which is kind of the world that big tech wants, are Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, right? It's the kind of stuff that is just melting people's brains. And I think that sort of, I'm quite into the nanny state, right? I think I don't really like when it's all about misinformation and sort of in times of high tension, because it all to me just sounds a bit meh. I'm like, I want us to be cultivating like healthy people who can sort of like relate to each other in society. It's the kind of Chinese Communist Party version of me, right? And I think that allowing the sort of YouTube model of discourse to dominate completely unrestricted and unrestrained, obviously I think TikTok's even worse, is wrecking society to some degree. And so in general, if the government says we're going to do something about this, obviously I think there are a million concerns that one can have, but I do think that something has to happen, and it's going to have to happen from the state.
I just find it so strange. And look, I think there's major problems with social media. I just don't think YouTube's anywhere near Facebook, X, Instagram. I'm sorry. And also YouTube by virtue, and of course that's changed slightly with these shorts. And of course, Novara Media posts shorts as well. But, it's an inherently long form medium, like, well, to a lesser extent than podcasts, but it's, it can be. And I agree with what you're saying about the American media landscape not being good, but I mean, I watch Tucker Carlson sometimes, and I often find him more informative. I sort of take, well, not sort of, I take literally everything he says with a giant pinch of salt, but I find it more informative than many interviews that the BBC has, Hard Talk with Stephen Sacco was quite good, but I have to be quite honest, I didn't learn that much watching it, and I don't
but
see
there's just so much of it is nonsense, right? If you're watching it and you're also watching like some left-wing stuff and you're also watching some centrist stuff, like I'm not in favor of banning any of it, but I do think that government should sort of curate to some degree what people are seeing, so that there is this sort of modicum of reality that we're all to some degree connected to.
Well, you are sort of in favor of shadow. I'm not in favor of banning. You're in favor, let's be clear, you're in favor of shadow banning stuff.
Well, I would do it more in a positive way. So as in I would shadow boost stuff, which is different from a shadow ban. But yeah, I would boost stuff that meets certain criteria.
Well, look, the story isn't going to go away, and we can talk about it a lot more. I'm just very suspect to stuff. This is where I come out as a sort of classical liberal. The state is a wonderful thing, but it's a necessary evil. Human beings are faulted. We aren't perfect. And of course,
this is not how you talk when we're talking about China, though.
The state is an accumulation of people. Well, look at China. Well, this is a great example, right? China has made some incredible choices, some huge bets which were right. It's also made some huge bets which were wrong, like the one-child policy. If we had this kind of thing, right, there were people saying the one-child policy is crazy. We have to stop it. The point of our system is that there's an outsider that says something like that, and over time they're proven right. If you have no dissent, I think you lose a really important fail-safe to reaching the truth. And I do think that's a big difference in Western China. And I think China's killing us right now. And I'm a Deng stan. I'm a bit more of a Mao stan than you are, Michael. But I just feel like we're losing something really serious and important in our culture if we don't have a place for iconoclasts. If we shadow ban iconoclasts, I think it's a really big problem. And I agree with you. So they're too central right now. I agree with you. But I think this proposal is going way too far.
I think it's very moderate, just saying we're going to give a little boost in the algorithm to the public service broadcasters. It's not banning anyone.
It's not just saying that, though. It's saying other people as well. Michael, we'll talk about this more. We agree on the public service broadcast bit. That's not the controversial one. Thanks for joining me tonight.
Pleasure.
I feel like Michael's a little bit angry. I can see the steam.
No.
As is.
I think, Aaron, to fill you in, it looks like we've missed one of the games of the tournament. I won't give away the result in case people didn't want spoiler, but you can look at it afterwards. If I'm looking slightly distracted.
There's only one game that matters, that's England-Norway.
True.
Thanks everyone else for tuning in tonight. Come back Monday. Monday? Is it Monday? No, it's not. Come back tomorrow, Wednesday, for another live stream from 6 p.m, potentially from home, as we flee the sweltering Novara towers. Today was a relatively cool 30 degrees C. That's the crazy world we're living in now, the temperate 30 degrees C in London. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Stay cool.